I can't hear you, sorry. Okay, so I don't know, should I introduce myself in a few words? Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today, or thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about the results of my research. A few words about myself. I'm currently finishing a postdoctoral scholarship at the PIASt, yes, Polish Institute for Advanced Studies in Warsaw. And basically, I've spent most of my research career studying post-Soviet Russian and Russian-speaking migrants. Did my PhD at UCL in the UK, and then did some postdocs in Romania and here in Warsaw. And what I'm going to be talking about now is the results of about a decade of work, including my PhD and a few papers that I wrote and a few studies that I have conducted. So it's a result of pretty intense engagement with certain relatively new scholarship on a particular section of UK migrant populations. And I've got a PowerPoint, and I suppose I should share my screen. Can you see? Okay. Okay, cool. So, yeah. First of all, who are the post-Soviet migrants in the UK? What do we mean when we are talking about these people? I should start by saying that I'm mainly using this term as a euphemism. It's an umbrella term. It's used in some migration research, but not too frequently. I mean, the very term post-Soviet, late Soviet, and ex-Soviet is not encountered very often in the actual migration studies, obviously because it's a pretty vague term. But post-Soviet migrants correlate to some extent to Central and Eastern Europe having become the most studied sending region for the UK migration studies, according to the results of a paper that was published a couple of years ago. Basically, they did a study of top UK migration journals and found out that Central and Eastern Europe was, not surprisingly, the most studied sending region. Why do we focus on them? Well, for a variety of reasons. Researchers themselves often come from migrant backgrounds, and that might be a factor in the choice of research topics. The quantitative factor is also one of the reasons. They have quite a significant number of migrants from Central and Eastern Europe, as well as from the former Soviet states, have appeared in the UK in the 21st century, and that has led to a surge in studies on them. These migrants are very diverse. They have various political, economic, social contexts of their mobility. A particular interest in the sending or receiving country, in this case the UK, can also prompt researchers' interests. Media attention and all sorts of hype about particular migrant groups, media stigmatization or something else can also trigger this interest. And last but not least, ease of access. I would say that I have observed a few times in my research career that people choose to study a particular migrant population, a particular subsection of this population, because they share the same background or they speak the same language, and they, for some reason, think that it would be easier for them to become an insider and generate some knowledge on a group with purportedly common background. Is that really so? Well, I don't really think that it's really so, and there have been a lot of methodological and ethical debates on the benefits of insiderism in migration research and so on. But anyway, this is a factor in choosing a research topic. So, as you probably know, migration from this broad part of the world to the UK has been increasing in the last few decades. If we're talking specifically about the ex-Soviet Union, um, the numbers of migrants from some of the countries of the former Soviet Union have started to increase in the 90s, but particularly in the first decade of the 21st century. And of course, the EU accession of 2004 has mattered a lot. So the numbers of migrants from the Baltic states have increased drastically around that time. And essentially, East European migrants, Central and East European migrants, have become an important part of a new and sizable trend for British migration, contributing to the emergent so-called super diversity. That's the term of the scholar Stephen Bertovic. Essentially, super diversity means that migrant groups are not only diverse between them, but also within them. So they move for a variety of different reasons. They follow different migration paths. They have different backgrounds. They have different legal statuses, and so on and so forth. And non-EU migration has also been on the rise since about early 2000s for various reasons, although it has not been that sizable as the EU migration to the UK. Just to give you a little bit of perspective on the numbers. So this data is a little bit old. It's from the census of 2011, and it's not about the country of origin or nationality. It's about the first language spoken by the migrants. And looking at that, you can see that actually there's not that many of migrants from the former Soviet countries. In the UK, well, Lithuanians followed by Lithuanian speakers or people identifying as Lithuanian speakers, then Russians, and then Latvians. This is more recent data. Those are estimates, so these are not the precise figures, and in cases of some of the countries, there's quite a significant margin of error, so do not take these figures as something concrete and precise, but again, just to give you a sense of perspective. And this is the data from last year. So that was the most recent data that I used for the publication of the paper that my current talk is based on. And I think I should also note here that when I first started thinking about this publication that I'm talking about now, it was a couple of years ago, and I used earlier estimates, and back then the numbers were higher, and that's already the impact of Brexit that we can see here. As you also probably know, Brexit has impacted the Central and East European populations of migrants in the UK, primarily, so fewer people were moving to the UK and more people were leaving the UK. And so a couple of years ago, these numbers were higher, specifically for people from the Baltic states. So what did I do here? Very briefly, basically what I did was I looked at the scholarship that has been published roughly between the EU accession 2004 and Brexit. I think I'm more or less accurately covering most of what has been published on migrants from various former Soviet countries in that period. And I myself have contributed to this scholarship somewhat. So that includes 92 academic sources, mostly articles published in British journals, migration studies, sociology, geography, anthropology, etc. Most of the papers were published in early to mid 2010s, and I myself, I'm a very typical representative here. So my first paper came out in 2012, and from then on, I've been publishing 1 or 2 papers each year and 1 book. So I'm very common. Just to give you some sort of visual representation, how my sources were split over the years. So yeah, you see most of the papers that have been published in this period were published in early to mid 2010s. So for the purposes of this talk, I've tried to answer two actually very simple questions. First of all, well, how do we as scholars describe our studied group whenever we choose to research some subsection, some part of the population of the former Soviet Union migrants in the UK? And whenever we are addressing a certain group, what are the key themes that we are addressing? How are we trying to disentangle? What are the research problems that we are seeing in our particular groups? And I started with sort of sifting through my sources and looking at, well, how do we describe the people that we are studying? And the most obvious terms would include Russian-speaking migrants or Russophone migrants. That's the term that I've used in quite a number of my publications. So again, nothing special about me here. Post-Soviet, late Soviet, or ex-Soviet. Also a term that is used, but not very often. There is a number of publications that focus on migrants from particular countries, but there is not that many of those publications. And migrants from the Baltic states in particular tend to end up in samples, wider and more diverse samples of East European, Central East European, and A8 migrants. Usually these mixed kind of samples emerge in quantitative studies, and they include a mix of migrants from countries like Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Lithuanians and Latvians quite often end up in these samples. Also, I've come across terms like Eastern Partnership, migrants from the Baltic states, some composite descriptions which are sometimes a bit clunky, but also they're an attempt to describe your studied group in a more accurate and politically correct way. And things like Eastern Slavic migrants or diasporas. Again, just to give you some sort of perspective, how frequently particular terms, particular designations can be encountered in the titles of the academic papers. So most often we have papers focusing on more or less migration in general, papers focusing on Russians and Russian speakers, and East Europeans and Central East Europeans, and that's followed by studies on particular countries and other umbrella terms. So now I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about each of the key categories that we can encounter in research on migrants from the former Soviet states. Well, first of all, of course, we have a lot of papers and PhD theses and a number of books published on Russian speakers or Russophone migrants. These studies have started to appear since about mid-2000s. That's when the researchers, again, who quite often, not always, but quite often tend to be from a Russian-speaking background, have started finishing their own PhDs and publishing their first papers and books. The main focus of studies on Russian speakers is usually has to do with communities, the ways they form and the ways in which they do not form, and how this is underpinned by particular commonalities of history, of language, or sociocultural commonalities, and so on. And this main focus is usually unpacked by a variety of themes which are quite common for migration research more generally. Topics like identities, imagined communities, transnationalism, transnational relationships, social networks, friendship, and of course, if we're talking about Russian speakers, there is a number of studies focusing on various aspects of communication, language practices, and media, online media, social media, and so on. I'm not a great fan of the term Russian speakers precisely because it's a bit too vague and ambiguous. And sometimes it's useful, but I also don't like it when it's used to describe segments of a very diverse population and occasionally used interchangeably with some other terms. This is just to present you some of the examples of things that have been written on Russian speakers in Britain. And this is a bad example. So if you remember, my talk was called How Not to Write About Russian Post-Soviet Migrants in the UK, and I'm going to give you a couple of bad examples as well. So in this particular case, the author is talking about Russian diasporic activities, Russian ethnic food scene, and Russian cookbooks, etc. The problem here is that the book that they bring up as an example is not exactly a Russian cookbook. It's a Ukrainian cookbook written by a quite famous Ukrainian food writer and cook. And the author of this book and her work have been actively used by the British Ukrainian community for some time to sort of showcase the attractiveness of the Ukrainian culture to the outsiders. And as you can imagine, the author of this quote that I'm showing you is from Russia. So this is not a good example, don't do that. But since we're talking about Russians, as I have already mentioned, the thing that I don't like about using the term Russians is when it's used interchangeably with the term Russian speakers. Of course, the identifications are complex and they can shift over time, yet it's not always appropriate to use this term interchangeably or as an umbrella term. And if you're looking at studies on Russians, we can come up to not separate trends, but to slightly different sets of topics. So in cases when Russians are used as an umbrella term to cover the subjects who self-identify as Russians but are not necessarily Russian nationals, we usually come across the whole variety of topics that I have just listed previously in the previous category. But since around early 2010s, a number of new studies have appeared that focus rather on Russian nationals and particularly, for example, on their involvement in transnational politics. Because the 2010s were the time when political tensions started to rise in Russia. There were large-scale protests taking place in the country, but also in migrant communities in the countries where these migrant communities were quite active. And of course, Britain was one of those places. And in this case, the involvement in transnational politics is unpacked via a set of topics such as diasporization. So on the one hand, that's Russia's compatriot policy, sort of from above, attempts to mobilize the compatriots. On the other hand, it's migrant self-mobilization and involvement in attempts to be involved in transnational politics from below. And also a number of studies have tackled, not specifically addressed, but tackled the ways in which migrants can position themselves in relation to Russia and to the West, sort of looking for their place in the imagined national and racial hierarchies in Britain, and so on. And security is also becoming a big topic now everywhere. Again, just to give you a few examples of things written on Russians. The book on the right by Helen Kopnina is the first real large-scale ethnographic study of Russian migrants in Britain and in the Netherlands. It has some disadvantages, but overall that's the first serious work, and it came out in 2005. And it also has this problem of using the terms Russian and Russian-speaking interchangeably. Another bad example in this sense. I want you to look at the quote on the right first. And it comes from a 2009 paper where it genuinely puzzles me. The author not only uses the terms Russians and Russian speakers interchangeably, but also tries to create a taxonomy of these migrants. And the three categories that they distinguish are highly skilled migrants, marriage migrants, and Russian speakers from the Baltic states. And I'm kind of struggling to understand the logics behind this taxonomy, because does this imply that highly skilled migrants cannot come from the Baltic countries? Does this mean that marriage migrants cannot come from the Baltic states? Where are the students? Where are the investors? Where are the illegal migrants? Where are the people who changed their migration status over the years? A lot of problem with the logics behind this classification, and I've been thinking for a while, what does it remind me of? And only quite recently I realized that it reminds me of this quite famous quote that you can see on the left from Borges, which is kind of a classic example of poorly constructed taxonomies that lack any logic behind them. But since I'm talking about Baltic migrants, that's another common category. And when we're talking about the migrants from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that's an interesting group of people because they can end up in samples of researchers of both Russian speakers and or Russians, and in those samples, which are focused on A8, Central and East European and East European migrants. Depending on how they are described or approached, they would be analyzed in slightly different ways. So if we study them as Russian speakers or Russians, that would be all the, we will be addressing all the common topics that I have already mentioned in the first two cases. But if we are looking at them as East Europeans or Central East Europeans or A8 migrants, they would commonly be approached as labor migrants. And the focus would much more likely be on the challenges and opportunities connected with their movement from the EU to Britain, and freedom of movement, but also discrimination and various challenges. And again, I'm reminding you that this sample of mine covers a pre-Brexit situation. And in the second case, the themes that the scholars would use to explore their situation would include things like work, like various transnational practices, remittances, return migration, migrants' impact on the labor market and the demographics and the economic situation of the sending country, homemaking, health risks, because these migrants are much more numerous than, say, Russian or Ukrainian nationals. It would be easier to conduct quantitative epidemiological studies on them. So I have come across a few epidemiological studies on health risks faced by those migrants, and various aspects of experiences of disadvantage, vulnerability, discrimination, and so on. But I think a good trend that I've come across in the last few years has been that scholars have not only been focusing on experiences of disadvantage and discrimination faced by East European migrants and migrants from the Baltic states in this particular case, but there have also been a few articles and I think one or two PhD theses written on the ways in which the move to Britain had been connected with self-realization, emancipation, and so on. So not only negative experiences. Again, just to show you some examples. I have mentioned work that emerges as an interesting, as a new topic in the case of the Baltic migrants. And it's an interesting thing because whenever we are focusing on post-Soviet, Russian-speaking, Russian Russophone migrants, work usually receives very little attention, if any, in these studies. Whenever it gets mentioned, it's mentioned in connection with their self-development, with career, upward social mobility, with high levels of education, and social and cultural capital, various sorts of engagement in transnational and local professional circles. In this case, these migrants are seen as relatively privileged, highly educated, highly skilled, and driven by career and lifestyle, not by primarily or purely economic concerns in their mobility and in their lives as migrants. Whenever we're looking at East European migrants or Central East European migrants, work is analyzed as labor. So we are looking at labor conditions. We are looking at, again, various experiences of disadvantage, forced labor, exploitation. The role of economic recession of 2008, for example, has been analyzed in some sources. And these migrants are commonly approached as highly educated, yet employed in low-skilled and low-wage jobs. Again, there has been a somewhat positive trend, or what I see as a somewhat positive trend in the recent years, because some of the recent research on Baltic migrants, the scholars have tried to depart from this sort of standard understanding of East European migrants as purely economic opportunists and have tried to approach them as driven by concerns of lifestyle, improvement of their lifestyle. And the last category here, that would be non-EU, non-Russian migrants. So people from the rest of the countries of the former Soviet Union. Usually they receive much less attention, and whenever we find them in the samples of scholars, they usually fall within the remit of post-Soviet Russian-speaking and Russian studies, naturally. They're quite diverse, and there is much fewer of them. Frequently, they are also considered as being highly educated but working in low-skilled jobs. Among all these people, I would say that Ukrainians have received somewhat more attention in the British migration studies. A few years back, there was a large-scale research project at the University of Oxford that has resulted in quite a few publications on Ukrainians, specifically on things like pioneering migration, exploring the particular condition of the local Ukrainian community, semi-legality, etc. And more recently, after the Euromaidan, there have been a few papers published on Ukrainians and their sort of attempts to engage in Ukrainian politics transnationally. I published a couple of papers on that as well. So again, nothing special about me here. I've come across some papers on Moldovans and Armenians and people from the Central Asia. Unfortunately, they don't receive much attention and at all. Whenever we see them in migration research, they usually simply end up in sort of Russian-speaking samples. And that's kind of a pity because they are approached simply as Russian speakers or in connection with the common Soviet past, but their specificity is not explored pretty much at all. Again, to show you some of the examples. Okay, and I'm moving slowly towards the end of my talk. So just to sum up, the things that I seem to be not quite happy about in the UK migration scholarship that is focused on migrants from the former Soviet states. First of all, as you might have guessed already, I often see some problems with the ways in which researchers delineate group boundaries of their studied samples. It's not always appropriate, it's quite often inappropriate to be using the terms interchangeably, such as post-Soviet, Russian-speaking, and Russian in this case, because that would imply lumping together quite different groups that, okay, they might have a lot in common, but there has been much more published on their commonalities than on the differences amongst different representatives of this group. And these differences, even if they are mentioned, even if their existence is mentioned by the scholar, they are not explored or they are not explored sufficiently. So I would argue that in this case, we would need more kind of particular studies. And quite often, I would hypothesize that this might be connected with the lack of cultural and political sensitivity on part of the researchers. Yeah. And another issue here is the problem of biased sampling. This particularly applies to studies on Russians and Russian speakers, because there is fewer of those migrants and it's next to impossible to do a proper representative quantitative research on them. And it's still a relatively new migrant population for the UK, so quite naturally, a lot of the studies on these migrants were and still are qualitative, which would often imply that the scholar is interviewing most accessible subject. Just imagine being a PhD student or a young researcher. Who would you go and interview if you want to study migrants from the same country as you, or migrants sharing the same background? You would go and study academics, bankers, journalists. I don't know. You wouldn't go and study homeless people, criminals, oligarchs, etc., etc. You wouldn't study groups that are less accessible to you, and that's kind of understandable. But that's the problem as well. And also, as another thing that I'm not very happy about in the contemporary research situation, it's the increase of non-scholarly publications, such as journalistic articles, such as think tank reports, sort of pseudo-expert commentary on these issues that lack quality and that have a lot of sensationalism in them. Or if these things are even based on research, the research methods are barely adequate. And the reason why I'm listing it here as a problem, well, of course, poor research quality of, say, think tank report is to blame on the think tank report writer in the first place. But also, whenever reading these think tanks, papers, policy reports, I remember struggling to see any single reference to any academic paper written on any aspect on former Soviet migration to the UK. And I struggled to remember seeing any reference to an interview conducted with a scholar of migration issues. And I think that's partly also the fault of the academics who sort of confine themselves to the proverbial ivory tower and do not do enough to engage with journalists, with wider populations, with wider audiences, with the results of their research. Yeah, and what do I see as coming next for migration studies? In this sense, again, just to reiterate, I think that we have already enough studies on middle class Russians or Russian speakers, and right now, well, we sort of already have a general picture of the former Soviet Union populations living in the UK, and right now is the time to explore differences rather than similarities and particularities of concrete migration groups in the UK. And secondly, of course, research, I think, should be grounded more in politically relevant contexts, like studying material culture of migrant homes is not a very politically interesting topic, I think, but there should be more focus on things like Brexit, like espionage, like corruption and money laundering in connection with migration. And the current predicament that we are finding ourselves in, the pandemic, the coronavirus, I think it has also created some, perhaps not new research topics, but it has created some new research directions to explore topics that have already been kind of relevant. So, for example, the role of social inequality for migration. If there is no mobility, then we can look at immobility and how it is connected with social inequality and health risks. Like if you're more privileged, you can afford to stay immobile, but if you're not, well, you just go somewhere to pick up asparagus. And in case of Russian migrants, for example, things like repatriations and return migration have become very prominent in the last couple of months because tens of thousands of Russians have found themselves stranded all over the world. And the Russian state, well, it's not doing exactly nothing to get them out of there, but I mean, they're still stranded. A lot of people are still sitting somewhere, losing hope of returning to their country. And we're not talking about migrants, or we're not talking about long-term migrants in this particular case, but we are talking about mobility. and the end of easy and flexible mobility. And yeah, and the final suggestion would be quite obviously improvement of the dialogue between academics and non-academic experts and writers, but also I think we need, from what I've seen, with some scholars, need to engage more with the sort of general migration scholarship and not to sort of confine themselves to area studies. I think that would be quite useful. And that's it. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Thank you.